Hello and welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm your host, Shannon Vasconcelos, and it's early April, so our high school seniors out there have received most, if not all, of their college decisions at this point. So I hope you've received some good news out there. I know that many of you are still waiting on financial aid offers due to all the FAFSA delays this year, but I hope some more good news will be coming your way soon from those financial aid offices. But I'm really excited about today's show. Speaking of the FAFSA, in our final segment, we're going to be discussing why students should consider completing the FAFSA, either now if you're a high school senior who hasn't done it yet, or in the future if you're an underclassman. But first, I'm super excited to welcome Emi Nietfeld, who is the author of the Bright Horizons College Coach very first book club selection. It is Acceptance, a Memoir. Those of you who are watching on YouTube can see it. Welcome, Emi.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here to talk about your book, which so probably give a quick summary for folks who have not been reading along with us, which you should have been. But if you haven't gotten a chance yet, Acceptance tells Emi's story, and you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, Emi, of your very challenging adolescence and the struggles that you had with mental health, both your own and your mother's mental health struggles, and being in foster care for a time, being homeless for a time, and navigating those challenges all the way to and through Harvard University, which of course is not the typical story of a Harvard student, I would say. But we're very glad to be able to talk about your book today, share it with our listeners. And I think we wanted to share with our listeners who are interested in college admissions, presumably because they listen to this podcast. I think it provides an interesting perspective on the admissions process. We also want to share with our listeners, because it is in fact a memoir, and we often recommend to the students that we're working with to read memoirs in preparation for writing their own college essays. As you might relate to, often the first time a student has been asked to write about themselves in a very reflective sort of manner, it often is the college essay, and they might be able to write book reports very well and science reports, but writing about yourself, as I'm sure you understand, is quite difficult, and you do it so well. So we wanted to sort of share this as an example of great memoir writing. But just, I guess, to start, why did you choose to write this book?
I started writing acceptance right after I submitted my college applications. Or I should say, I started writing an essay that basically outlined exactly what acceptance was going to be about 10 years later. And I, so I was coming from very difficult circumstances. And speaking of college essays, I felt like my way to compete as a college applicant was with sharing my story and doing so in my personal statement and in a letter of extenuating circumstances, kind of explaining what had happened in my life.
Right.
But this process was really hard. And I think it's challenging for any student, but particularly when you're writing about trauma or injustice, it was so grueling to have to present myself really as this overcomer who had been made stronger by all of these challenges when
Mhm.
I was still in the middle of those challenges.
Yes.
And so I started writing acceptance because I wanted to tell the whole story and show this complicated reality that teenagers are living through. So often we see these human interest stories that hold up young people as these like perfect bootstrappers. I was one of them, right?
Mhm.
But that that is not reality. That is not the full story. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that and acknowledge that even the people we see who seem to be so successful and end up where we want to be, they're still struggling with things, right? And you do not see the whole picture in the media.
Yeah. And I think that as you talk about towards the end of your book, particularly that narrative of anyone can do it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, really can sort of excuse systemic inequities, um, when we just focus on that narrative that it's all right if the system is messed up because as an individual you can pull yourself out. So I love calling attention to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the title of the book, I love
Yes.
acceptance. Here on a college admissions podcast, we think of college acceptances, which I imagine is part of the reason you titled the book that. But tell me more about the title. I imagine there's more than that.
When I was in therapy as a teenager, I went to a lot of therapy, most of which unfortunately was not good, but there is great therapy out there. One of the things that I was told all the time was that I had to accept my situation,
Mm,
that I was going to be miserable for the rest of my life unless I could just make peace with the fact that my mom was a hoarder, that we lived in squalor, that my future just seemed to be looking narrower and narrower every day.
mhm.
And I really hated this advice.
Yeah.
And I wanted to change my life and change my life specifically by getting into going to and graduating from college. And so when I came up with the title acceptance, the first meaning really was this defiant
Mm,
meaning of, an ironic, like, no, I was not accepting what happened.
yeah.
But obviously it also is about getting into college and about accepting ourselves and the things that happen to us and the
Yep.
fact that when we go through hard times, we're impacted by them and really making peace with the fact that that's okay, despite some of the social messages that we have that are always encouraging us to be positive at all costs.
Yep, for sure. So what did I know from reading the book for folks who didn't read the book? What was it that college meant to you as a high school kid going through all these struggles? I think it meant more to you than it did for me from a, relatively privileged, sort of stable home.
Mm.
I think it meant something different to you.
Yeah, I had always been a bookworm. I loved studying. I hated weekends and vacations, in part because I was with my parents, right, who had a
Yeah.
very tumultuous relationship. But I also saw it as this just ticket to a totally different life.
Yeah.
My mom, when she was growing up, had dreamed about attending Stanford.
Hmm.
And, you know, how many years later, 30 years later, it would be 8 a.m. We were scraping ice off the car. Like it was still pitch black in Minnesota at that hour. And my mom would be like, if I had gotten into Stanford, I'd be in California underneath a palm tree.
Mm,
She had kind of a tedious job as a crime scene photographer. And she's like, if I had gone to Stanford, I would be a neurosurgeon. And a lot of people find these statements a little bit outlandish,
mhm.
but having gone through that type of upward mobility, I'm like, she had a point.
Mm, yeah.
And I don't think that's necessarily true for every single student who's applying
Right.
to college. I think we can like place way too much emphasis on these elite universities, but I think that there is research out there that's like if you're coming from a tough spot, certain schools really can give you a huge boost into the middle class or the upper middle class.
Right. And I've seen similar research that is much more the case if you are coming from this underprivileged background. The benefit of these selective schools is far greater than for folks who might be coming from relatively privileged backgrounds. To begin with, it doesn't make such a difference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Would you go back now as an adult, looking back at your high school self, would you have any different sort of messaging to your younger self now, knowing what you know, or are you fully on board with you did what you had to do at that time?
Well, I wish I could be a lot kinder to myself,
Yeah.
and I wish I knew how the story turned out. And I also I'm grateful for the decisions that I made and for being so invested in this like college application game. But I think one of the things that was really, really hard for me as a teenager was, you're going through this developmental time when you're thinking so much about authenticity, thinking about who am I, all those big questions. And when I got to the college essay, I was like, it was framed to me as show them who you are. This is a matter of identity. And that framing was really, really unhelpful for me.
Mm.
Especially because, I did not have my life figured out. I did not know who I was.
And
And
I'd say most, 17-year-olds
no,
don't.
that's totally like if you do good for you, but you are rare because that's the time
Yeah.
of your life when you're figuring it out. And so, I wish that I had had the guidance to kind of be able to untangle, okay, here's my big, messy, real story. And then here's kind of the sliver that I'm going to tell colleges. And really to feel
Right.
okay with that and feel like I have the right to privacy about things I don't want to talk about.
Sure.
And that I'm not doing anything inauthentic by, putting my best foot forward.
For sure. And is that the message that you would give to students who are thinking about writing about mental health challenges in their college essay? It can be really difficult to navigate. What would you say to them?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to have a space where you can talk about mental health and you
Hmm.
can be really honest with people and feel that kind of acceptance that you are okay as a person, that you're a good person, that what you're going through
Hmm.
is normal. And I think that college applications are often not that space
Yeah.
and that but I mean with my own writing even today as an adult like I have to have somebody that I trust read my early drafts
Hmm.
and just tell me, I love you. You're great as a person.
Yes.
And I need to do that before I can take the next step and really be like, okay, what is my goal here? Who is the
Mhm.
target audience? Particularly
Yeah.
because so much has changed generationally, right? Between like Gen Z applicants and, people who are sitting in the admissions office who might be millennials, they might be Gen X, they might be boomers and have a totally different frame of reference for what's going on.
For sure. And you actually wrote an interesting op-ed just recently for the New York Times about test optional admissions. And it's in support of the handful of big name colleges that have come out recently, reversing their test optional policy and requiring testing again. And you came out sort of in support of that, which I found interesting again from my sort of privileged position here. And as an adult, I wanted to say to young Emi and other kids now in similar situations, you have enough to worry about. You shouldn't have to worry about the SAT. But
Mhm.
that's not your perspective. So I'm interested to hear what your perspective on that.
Elite college admissions are definitely really unique and
Yeah.
it's not what works for a Harvard or a Yale or Brown is not necessarily what's going to work for a state university or a small private liberal arts college. And I think it's really hard as an applicant to set yourself apart,
Mhm.
particularly when your life story has shown up on your transcript, shown up in a lack of relationships. I attended between 5 and 6 different high schools, depending on how you counted. My foster mother said that my transcript had so many holes that it looked like Swiss cheese. And so for me, there really wasn't another good way to show that I was academically qualified than by taking these standardized tests. And even in a period where I had my education severely interrupted by mental health treatment and changing schools, I was able to teach myself some of the material from these library test prep books. And in writing this op-ed, I talked to a lot of other students who were the children of immigrants or who were living abroad and who felt similarly, right? Where this was like their chance. And I think that the reason that I am in favor of these elite colleges requiring the SAT again is in part because of what Dartmouth found in an analysis where lower income and racial minority students were often not submitting test scores that would have helped them get in because they felt like, okay, this score is too low compared to the average applicant. When Dartmouth said, no, actually, we're comparing you against people who are from your high school from similar situations, kind of using that as a signal for who has potential in this pool. And I think that the other reason it can be useful for these schools, not just to go test optional, but to require them again, is this thing of, if you're a disadvantaged student, why should you have to study for the standardized tests when other students don't? And I
Yes.
think that that adds another level of like fairness into the conversation
Yep.
where I talk to college counselors who are like, I feel really bad telling the student who already has so much on their plate and more on their plate than a wealthier peer, hey, you have to study for this. You have to prove yourself in this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is so tough. And I think the intention behind test optionality, if that's a word, was good to remove stress from this process, but it has had perhaps unintended consequences of creating this new stress of, do I test or do I not test? If I do have scores, do I submit them? Do I not? And as you point out, and as that Dartmouth study pointed out, you need to have very good advising to be able to navigate those new questions and new challenges in a test optional environment. And of course,
Yeah.
the less privileged you are, the less likely you are to have that good advising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of schools implemented test optional policies hoping that it would make their student bodies more diverse and that it would be a
Yeah.
more equitable admissions process. And unfortunately, this is now a political topic. Personally, I think those are very worthy goals.
Yeah.
And then that it's also important to look at the data
Right.
for each school, right? Of is
Sure.
this if this is this really doing what's intended or not? And that was really what convinced me to write this op-ed and share this unpopular opinion because I could love these tests and they could be horrible. Both
Right.
things can be true at once, but yeah.
Completely. So to move sort of a little bit further along in your story, you did navigate all these challenges. You did get to Harvard University. You did get to sort of achieve this dream that you were so focused on throughout high school. What happened when you got there? Did you feel, now have you proven yourself, and now do you feel that you fit in this environment, or was it not that smooth?
There was pretty severe culture shock.
Yeah.
I could not even understand what shoes people were wearing. Like everybody seemed to have these brown leather loafers that were so ugly. And it turns out they're called boat shoes and you can wear them to sail. Um and it was, I know the data is that the schools has a lot of people that are on financial aid and that are on full financial aid. But the culture very much was dominated by this upper middle class East Coast prep scene. And
Sure.
so and I was still carrying around all this baggage from my
Yeah.
childhood, right? Like I hoped I would just show up on campus and it would all disappear. And that was not the case for me. That is not the case for many students. And but I did eventually find my place and I studied computer science. I joined the rowing team, all things that like I never could have imagined doing. And so it
Yeah.
really did open up those doors for me.
Sure. In retrospect, as you look back on it, knowing more as an adult, do you think that Harvard was the best place for you? Do you think that other colleges could have met those needs, perhaps even better for you, or no?
It took me a couple years after graduating to even think about that question actually. And
Yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
I really wanted to go to Wellesley or one of the other women's colleges.
Hmm.
And I remember meeting people from Wellesley and being like, wow, I think I might have had a much better time there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, when I thought about my goals for the future and the reality of financial aid, which was that Harvard gave me the most by about
Yeah.
$13,000 a year, um it it was kind of a no-brainer. And so I
Yeah.
do I do think sometimes there's so much pressure on teenagers to optimize for like what school will make you the happiest.
Hmm.
And I feel grateful that I went to a good enough school, which
Yes.
feels silly to call Harvard that, but really like it was a good
I love
enough
it.
fit, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
I love describing Harvard that way. They probably don't
they
often get
deserve
described
it.
that way. I like it.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Harvard was the most generous with with financial aid. I'm actually former financial aid officer. So this part of the story actually
Ooh,
fascinates me. I don't know how much the
yeah.
money fascinates other people, but can you talk a little bit about that financial
Yeah.
journey and applying for financial aid in the situation you were in and the support that Harvard gave you?
Absolutely. I knew basically I need either a full ride or I need to go to a school that has in-state tuition. But if
Mhm.
I went to a school that had in-state tuition, I figured I was going to be going into some amount of debt. And I was applying for college in 2009 to 2010, which probably makes me sound like a dinosaur to some of the younger listeners. But that was around the time that these elite colleges were expanding their financial aid programs. And so for families at the time, it was under $60,000 a year of household income, they were promising you would pay nothing. And so
Yeah.
for me, that really, it gave me a set of schools where I was like, okay, if I can get in here, that is a huge financial difference between there and one of the schools I applied and got into offered me $200,000 in student loans.
Wow.
Right. So zero versus 200,000. It was definitely very stressful because I had a unique family situation. And
Mhm.
so on the FAFSA, I was an independent student, which very, very few students are, but I had been in foster care and I had been homeless, both of which qualified me. But I still had to explain this to every single school.
Yeah.
I had not been in contact with one of my parents for over a decade.
Mm.
And that was another minefield. So
Yeah.
overall, the financial aid application process was extremely stressful.
Yeah.
But it was, it was really necessary.
Right. And in the end, you got to the school that had the resources to be extremely generous with you. I think you
Yes.
said, was it in your book or I might have heard you on another podcast? There was even a winter coat fund for
Yes.
kids who couldn't afford to buy winter coats and maybe aren't used to the Boston weather. You were probably used to it from being in Minnesota.
Yeah, but I had like the thinnest, people from Minnesota
Yeah.
have like the thinnest jackets, So that $150 check to get the coat was like
Yeah.
huge. And yeah, I think that is I think it's important to acknowledge that is something that elite schools
Hmm.
can provide to students. And so sometimes when people are obsessed with these top colleges, it's not because those schools are better or that they're going to give a
Yeah.
better education, but just that they have these resources that I wish all students in America had, but unfortunately, that is not the reality right now.
Yep, completely. Now, you mentioned you majored in computer science, which I think maybe some people, even reading some of your history, it seemed you really loved writing, and clearly now you are writing. Tell me about that decision to major in computer science.
I came on campus and I was like, I need a job.
Yeah.
Um, I ended up taking a gap year and I worked as an assistant at Disney, which was a job that I knew people were really lining up for out the door.
Yeah.
But I did not have dental insurance. I had to get my wisdom teeth taken
Mhm.
out when I was like fully awake at a dental school as a practice patient. So I was like, okay, that's my goal, dental insurance.
Yeah.
Um, and so I went to a computer science lecture, like one of the first day of classes, and I can't say I was in love with it, but it was definitely just so different and so
Mhm.
fascinating. And I ended up finding this really cool community of other women who were studying computer science and who really mentored me and helped me get internships and then a job as a software engineer. And so that's what I did for the first 5 years or so out of school. And it was a wild ride. But I have no regrets about that. And I ended up switching to writing full time. But part of why I can do that is that I know that I have this set of skills that I can fall back on
Yes.
if I need to feed myself or my family.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned you finding this great community in the computer science department. I know from your book, you also found a great community on the rowing team for Harvard, which was a new activity for you. So I'm curious about your perspective on extracurricular activities. We
Mhm.
get asked, all the time from high school students or their parents, what activities should I be doing? The implication, what is the right activity that will get me into Harvard or other colleges? Um, Can you tell me a little bit about the role that extracurriculars kind of played for you?
For me, once I found extracurriculars, that was when I felt at home on
Yeah.
campus.
Yeah.
And it was pretty different than in high school where I felt so much pressure to like build my resume, and
Mhm.
I did things like join the intramural soccer team just to put it on the resume,
Yep.
and then I did not put it on my resume because it did not matter and did not fit the profile.
Right.
But it was but it those things just really opened up my world where it was stuff that I had never thought about doing. And even though my major was kind of pre-professional, right? And it was heading in a certain direction, extracurriculars were my place to explore. And so if you are a young woman in America and you're either pretty short or really tall, I would really suggest rowing. Like there were people being recruited for rowing who had never been in a boat before.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for Title IX, which is really what made women's rowing in America a
Mhm.
huge college sport and
Yep.
just an amazing opportunity. Because to be able to become a Division 1 athlete after not being able to run a mile for the
Wow.
first like 18 years of your life,
Yeah.
it was such a trip and such a wonderful experience. So I just really encourage people to seek out the people that are going to make you feel good. And sometimes what the activity is doesn't even really matter that much. You
Yeah.
might really surprise yourself with what you enjoy doing.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice. And speaking of advice, I mentioned at the beginning of the pod here, college seniors have probably just gotten their college acceptances. I'm sorry, high school seniors have just got their college acceptances recently. And now they are got, a few weeks or a few months. The timeline at some schools is a little bit delayed this year. Um, but they'll be making this big college decision over the coming weeks. What advice would you have for seniors making these decisions now?
Oh, man. I I would definitely, as much as possible, be aware of debt. Like
Mhm.
go and fill out a debt calculator. Look up
Oh,
like what is
you are
the
speaking my language,
yeah.
Emmy.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big, and think about what you want to do after college, right?
Yeah.
And I knew a lot of people who wanted to go to medical school.
Hmm.
And if you have private college debt and then medical school debt,
Yep.
that's really hard. And
Yeah.
I also know people who went to Harvard and who were not able to apply to medical school right away. They had to take several gap years.
Mm.
And some of those people were like, yeah, if I had gone to my state school or to another college, I probably would have been able to apply to med school right away and be
Hmm.
practicing as a doctor 3 or 4 years earlier.
Yeah.
And so I think we often place so much emphasis on the college experience, but I would encourage young people to think about the long run and where they want to end up after college. And also just emotionally, I think whatever you're feeling is okay. And it
Hmm.
was so difficult for me when I got into Harvard that I was elated at first, and then I was kind of depressed and disappointed because
Yeah.
my life was not changing immediately as I hoped it would. And I
Yes.
think for a lot of young people, getting into college or not is really the
Mhm.
first time you experience huge disappointment and devastation, or, life-changing success, or sometimes both.
Yes.
And just working through those feelings and realizing that neither one feels the way you thought it would.
Yeah, that's so true. I think we all do this. We pin our hopes on something. And as a kid, it's often that college acceptance. As an adult, it might be, well, when I get promoted at work, everything will be okay. Or when I find this relationship, everything will be okay. Usually it's not those external validation points that they don't quite fix everything that you hope they would. Yeah.
So well said.
Yeah. And we're just about running out of time, but I definitely wanted to get to, before I let you go, not only do we have students and parents who listen to this podcast, but we have a lot of school counselors who listen. And I know that you sort of struggled with, I would say, a lot of the adults in your life kind of letting you down as a kid. And so I would love to hear what words of wisdom you might have for the school counselors who are listening, who are working with lots of kids and lots of situations, some challenging situations like you had. What would you say to those school counselors that have the opportunity to work with kids who might be going through some challenges?
I'm so glad you asked this because school counselors play such an important role in students' lives.
Yeah.
One thing that I wish I had had more help navigating was how to handle writing about mental health in my college
Mm.
applications. And today that is such a huge issue, with some estimates saying that 50% of incoming college students have at least one diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a piece about this last year for the New York Times called I edited mental illness out of my college applications. I'm not alone.
Mm.
And this piece really talks about how mental health crisis can manifest very, very differently in different students, particularly because of privilege,
Yeah.
right? And I think that college counselors can play a really important role in helping students both navigate disclosure and, in some cases, in being the person who, in concert with the student, can explain if
Mhm.
there's like a gap in their transcript,
Yeah.
or a time when their grades went lower. When I
Yeah.
was applying, it really was like all on me
Yeah.
until I got a letter from a mentor who was able to be super real about my
Mhm.
family drama
Yep.
and about these difficult circumstances. And because she was an outsider, it didn't sound negative or anything like that. It was just
Yeah.
honest. And so I wish that every student kind of had that person advocating for them. And I don't think it's necessarily that time consuming or that resource intensive, but just I wish more people realized that that was an option and kind of
Yes.
knew the toolkit that counselors have for helping students who are trying to explain that stuff.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's great advice. And to students, if ask your counselor if you need some of this stuff. You probably don't know that counselors are able to write these letters explaining these things, and that's part of their job. So don't hesitate to ask. Oh, this is such a great conversation. I'm so glad I got to talk to you, Emmy, and so glad I got to read your book, and I hope others will pick it up. But other than picking up your book, is there other ways that folks out there can follow you and your work?
Yes, I am at emineetfeld.com. I have a monthly newsletter, and I'm a full-time writer. So I'm writing about college inequality, mental health, and some Silicon Valley culture stuff that's just fun to read.
Ooh.
So yeah.
That does sound like fun. So thanks so much again, Emmy, for sharing your story and for chatting with me today. I definitely got a lot out of it. I'm sure that our listeners did too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for having me.
You're welcome. And if you haven't read Emmy's book yet, I'll hold it up again. Acceptance, a Memoir. We'll put a link up on the College Coach social media pages so you can find that book. So thanks again, Emmy. And
Thank you.
listeners, stick around. When we come back, we're going to be discussing the FAFSA. So stay tuned.